On the slopes of Mount Royal, above the Golden Square Mile, a mansion has stood for over 160 years. It is built of gray limestone that was rough-hewn by hand, stone that looks less constructed than excavated, as if the mountain itself pushed the building up from its own body. A central tower rises above the roofline, its cupola dark against the Montreal sky. At night, according to those who have walked the campus below, a light sometimes appears in that tower when no one should be there. The mansion has had two names. The first was Ravenscrag, given by the family who built it after a castle back in the Scotland they had left behind. The second is the Allen Memorial Institute, given by the institution that consumed it and that filled its stone rooms with screaming. It is, depending on which chapter of its life you examine, a monument to ambition, a museum of grief, a chamber of horrors, or all three simultaneously. The man who built Ravenscrag was once the richest person in Canada, a shipping tycoon who bribed a prime minister, destroyed a government, and died in exile with his reputation in ruins. The family that inherited it watched every one of their children die. Two daughters drowned in the Atlantic when a German torpedo struck the ocean liner carrying them. A son shot down in the skies over the English Channel on his very first combat mission. The institution that replaced the family used its hallways to conduct government-funded experiments on unwitting patients, erasing their memories, dissolving their identities, feeding them LSD, while playing recorded messages into their sleeping ears 24 hours a day. The blueprints for what happened inside Ravenscrag's stone walls would later appear in CYA torture manuals used at Guantanamo Bay and black sites around the world. And to this day, no one has apologized. No one has been held accountable. The experiments are classified. The files have been destroyed. And in the tower above the campus, a light still appears in the dark hours before dawn. This is not merely a ghost story. This is the story of what power does when no one is watching, of what ambition costs the people who carry it, of what a building absorbs when the worst of what human beings are capable of is practiced inside its walls, generation after generation, without consequence. This is the story of Ravenscrag. The question is not whether it is cursed. The question is, who put the curse there? To understand Ravenscrag, you first have to understand what Montreal was in the mid-19th century. In the decades after Confederation, Montreal was not simply Canada's largest city. It was its only city, in the sense that mattered. Every major bank was headquartered there, every great shipping company, every railroad syndicate. The port of Montreal was the pivot point of an empire, the place where the wheat and timber of an entire continent passed on its way to the markets of Europe. Whoever controlled the port effectively controlled Canada. On the southern slope of Mount Royal, in a neighborhood that would come to be called the Golden Square Mile, the men who controlled everything built their houses. Not modest houses, not sensible houses, palaces, towers of rough limestone and imported marble, set behind iron gates with views that swept across the city and down to the river below. At its peak, the Golden Square Mile was said to contain more wealth per acre than any other neighborhood on earth. This was a city built on a very particular bargain, enormous wealth purchased at enormous cost. The shipping lines that enriched the Square Mile's residents were crewed by workers paid starvation wages. The railroads that carried their goods were built on land taken from indigenous peoples by force. The banks that held their fortunes extended credit to the powerful and extracted interest from the desperate. Montreal's elite understood all of this, and they chose, almost uniformly, not to think about it. The mansions on the hill were, in that sense, a collective act of selective memory, a monument to what could be accumulated when one refused to calculate what had been taken. Into this world, in 1860, a man named Hugh Allen purchased 14 acres on the mountain slope, the former estate of fur trade magnate Simon McTavish, who had died before completing his own manor house on the site. Allen paid $10,000 for the land. He had his predecessor's unfinished shell demolished and began building something entirely new. All it needed was the most ruthless operator in Canadian history to fill it with ambition. Hugh Allen was born in 1810 in Saltcoats, Ayrshire, Scotland, the son of a sea captain who understood that the ocean was not a barrier but a road. He arrived in Montreal at the age of 16 with nothing except his father's maritime instincts and an appetite that the city, to its eventual regret, could not satisfy. By 1839, he was a senior partner in a general merchandising company. By 1853, he and his brother Andrew owned their own steamship company, the Montreal Ocean Steamship Company, which would eventually become the Allen Line, carrying passengers and freight between Montreal, Glasgow, and Liverpool. By the time he received his knighthood in 1871, the Allen Line operated the largest private shipping empire in the world. His ships crossed the North Atlantic on schedules that the Royal Mail Post Office depended on. His name was synonymous with Canada's commercial identity on the global stage. He was also, by the assessments of almost everyone who knew him, a deeply unpleasant man. Gruff, tight-fisted, contemptuous of those below him and ruthlessly calculating toward those above. He employed child labor in his factories. He exploited his workers with a directness unusual even for the standards of his era. He once complained, surveying the 11 servants required to run his household, that Ravenscrag had become a hotel for servants. The irony was that the hotel for servants had been built, stone by stone, on the labor of people who would never be invited inside it. Construction of Ravenscrag began in 1860 and was completed in 1863, carried out by builders Victor Roy and John Hopkins. Allen's instructions were absolute: build something that would make clear to anyone who looked up at Mount Royal from the city below exactly who was in charge of Montreal. The result was a 72-room palazzo on 5 floors, 53,475 square feet of limestone grandeur built in the Italian Renaissance style, with a central asymmetric tower, wide terraces, and an observatory at the top from which Hugh Allen could scan the port with a telescope, tracking the movements of his ships below. The house was wired for gas lighting, a technological marvel in 1863. It had the most advanced plumbing and heating systems available in North America. Ravenscrag rose above the city. The tower caught the light. The shipping magnate looked down through his telescope at the river below. But a man who controls a city has a tendency to reach for the next thing. And the next thing, for Sir Hugh Allen, was a country. The year was 1872, and Canada needed a railway. When British Columbia entered Confederation in 1871, the federal government had promised a transcontinental railway linking the Pacific coast to the eastern provinces, a promise so enormous that it defined the entire project of Canadian nationhood. Without the railway, British Columbia would leave. Without British Columbia, the country's western ambitions collapsed. The railway was not a transportation project. It was the spine of a nation. 2 syndicates competed for the contract to build it. Sir Hugh Allen's was the larger, the wealthier, and the most politically connected. The government of Prime Minister Sir John A. Macdonald needed campaign funds for the 1872 federal election. The rest, as they say, was the Pacific scandal. Allen funneled more than $360,000 into the Conservative Party's 1872 election campaign, an astronomical sum equivalent to tens of millions of dollars today. In return, his syndicate received the charter to build the Canadian Pacific Railway. The arrangement was not subtle. Allen was a prolific letter writer who kept meticulous records of his correspondence with Macdonald and senior cabinet ministers. Those letters, when they were later stolen from the office of Allen's lawyer John Abbott by a disgruntled private secretary named George Norris and sold to the Liberal opposition for $5,000, would detonate the most catastrophic political scandal in Canadian history. On April 2, 1873, Liberal Member of Parliament Lucius Seth Huntington rose in the House of Commons and announced what he had found. The chamber erupted. Newspapers across the country reprinted the stolen telegrams verbatim. The most damaging was perhaps the simplest, a message from Macdonald to Allen that demanded in plain language more money for the campaign. The implication was impossible to deny. Macdonald gave a marathon speech in the House on November 3, 1873, defending himself for hours, drinking steadily from tumblers of gin as he spoke, never quite addressing the central accusation. It was not enough. On November 5, 1873, the Conservative government resigned. The first Prime Minister of Canada had been brought down, and the man whose money had caused it all looked on from his tower above Montreal. Allen never built the railway. The contract was cancelled. His dream of transcontinental dominance evaporated. He continued to accumulate wealth through other means and died on December 9, 1882, in Edinburgh, far from the city he had dominated, far from the tower that bore his name. At the time of his death, his fortune was estimated at between £8 and £12 million, equivalent to approximately $2.5 billion today. All flags in Montreal were lowered to half-mast. The mayor and every city councillor walked in the funeral procession. It was the city's last gesture of respect for a man it had depended on and never quite trusted. He left Ravenscrag to his son Montague, and with it, he left a question the House would spend the next century trying to answer. What happens to a palace when the king who built it is gone? Where Hugh Allen had been feared, his son Montague was beloved. Sir Hugh Montague Allen, born at Ravenscrag in 1860, inheriting it in 1882 at the age of 22, was, by nearly every account, a fundamentally decent man. He was generous in a way his father had never been. He was warm, sociable, a genuine enthusiast for sport and culture and the life of his city. While his father had built Ravenscrag as a monument to power, Montague transformed it into something altogether more human. The unquestioned social center of Montreal's elite, the place where the city's public life and private life merged into one shimmering, formally dressed whole. An invitation to a ball at Ravenscrag was the most coveted social distinction in Montreal. When Sir Rodolphe Forget was unable to accompany his wife to one such occasion, he consoled her grief by spending several thousands of dollars on a pearl necklace, deemed the only suitable recompense for the slight. The ballroom at Ravenscrag was that kind of institution. Montague hosted British royals, Japanese princes, and the Prince of Wales, who attempted to travel incognito as Lord Renfrew and was recognized immediately, and who was present for a party in which the dancer Argentina held court in the ballroom while the president of Canadian National Railways imitated the love dance of an elephant in the drawing room. Ravenscrag, under Montague, had a sense of humor that his father had never permitted. The Allen Cup, donated by Montague in 1908 as the trophy for men's amateur ice hockey supremacy in Canada, remains in competition to this day. He co-founded the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Montreal. He served as president of the Montreal General Hospital. He married Marguerite Ethel Mackenzie in October 1893. They had 4 children, Martha, Hugh, Anna, and Gwendolyn. Their children ran through the mansion's 72 rooms. Their guests filled the ballroom with music. By 1914, Ravenscrag stood at the absolute apex of everything the Golden Square Mile represented, the most magnificent house in the country's wealthiest neighborhood, occupied by a family whose reputation was generous, whose conduct was honorable, whose social standing was unassailable. The Golden Age seemed like it would last forever. Then came the summer of 1914, and with it, a war that would take everything. May 1st, 1915. New York Harbor. Lady Marguerite Allen stood on the pier surrounded by 18 steamer trunks packed by the maids of Ravenscrag. She was 42 years old. She was traveling to England to organize a convalescent hospital for Canadian soldiers, her contribution to a war that had turned the world to carnage. With her were 2 of her daughters, Anna, 16, and Gwendolyn, 15. Her maids, Emily Davis and Annie Walker, would travel with them. The Imperial German Embassy in Washington had placed a warning in American newspapers that morning, directly beneath an advertisement for the Lusitania's return voyage, announcing that ships sailing the Atlantic did so at their peril. The waters around Britain were a declared war zone. German submarines were active and aggressive. Lady Marguerite boarded the Lusitania anyway. Everyone did. The ship was the fastest ocean liner on the Atlantic. Even running at reduced capacity, she could make 21 knots, faster than any German submarine. The German warning was understood as propaganda. The Lusitania was considered beyond danger. On May 7, 1915, at 2:10 in the afternoon, while the passengers of the first-class lounge finished lunch and drank coffee, a single torpedo fired from German U-boat U-20 struck the Lusitania's starboard bow. The ship carried 1,989 passengers and crew. It sank in 18 minutes. Of the 1,201 who died, nearly 100 were children. Lady Marguerite, her daughters, and the maids were in the lounge when the torpedo struck. They rushed to the boat deck. The ship's catastrophic list to starboard made the lifeboats almost impossible to launch. When the Lusitania slipped beneath the surface of the Irish Sea, within sight of the coast of Ireland, Anna and Gwendolyn Allen went with it. Lady Marguerite was pulled from the water, severely injured. She survived. Gwendolyn's body was recovered the following day. She was tagged Body 218. Her body was returned to Montreal for burial. Anna's body was never found. The news reached Ravenscrag. Sir Montague, who had remained behind in Montreal, received word that 2 of his children were gone, that his wife lay injured in an Irish hospital, that 16-year-old Anna would never come home. He was 54 years old, and the worst was not yet over. In 1916, with his sisters dead and the war still devouring a generation, the Allens' only son Hugh enlisted with the Royal Naval Air Service. On July 7, 1917, he was shot down over the English Channel during his very first combat mission. He was 21 years old, 3 children, gone within 2 years. The 4th, Martha, the eldest, who had not been on the Lusitania, who had driven ambulances at the front, who founded the Montreal Repertory Theatre, and launched the careers of a generation of Canadian actors, including a young man whose great-grandfather had been her grandfather's lawyer, a boy who would one day be known as Christopher Plummer. Martha lived until 1942, when she died of pneumonia at the age of 47, having never married. Sir Montague and Lady Marguerite outlived all four of their children. They are buried together in the Mount Royal Cemetery next to two of their daughters. In the Tower of Ravenscrag, the telescope that Hugh Allen had used to watch his ship still sat in the cupola above the city. No one used it anymore. There was nothing left to watch for. For the last 2 decades of their lives, Sir Montague and Lady Marguerite rattled through Ravenscrag like two survivors in a mansion designed for a family that no longer existed. The money was still there, diminished from its Victorian peak, but sufficient. The house was still magnificent. But the purpose that had animated Ravenscrag, the children, the guests, the balls, the social machinery of a family at the center of everything, had been extinguished. The Golden Square Mile itself was fading. The era of the great urban mansion was ending. In November of 1940, with Montague in his 80th year and the Second World War raging over the same European skies that had killed his son, Lady Marguerite signed the papers donating Ravenscrag to the Royal Victoria Hospital. The terms of the bequest specified that the property would be used as a medical facility, and that if it ever ceased to be used as one, ownership would revert to the Allen descendants. The hospital accepted the gift with the careful gratitude of an institution uncertain what to do with a 72-room Victorian palazzo on the slope of Mount Royal. For nearly 3 years, hospital administrators debated the building's fate. They considered demolishing it. They deliberated while Ravenscrag sat empty, its ballroom silent, its tower dark, its stone walls absorbing the quiet of a house waiting for its next purpose. In 1943, a decision was made. Ravenscrag would become a psychiatric hospital, the first of its kind in Canada. Architects Harold Lawson and H.B. Little were commissioned to transform the mansion's interior. Almost everything was stripped away. The ornate Victorian furnishings, most donated to Montreal's École du Meuble, were hauled out. The fireplaces, the paneling, the accumulated aesthetic of 80 years of family life were dismantled. Only a wall of the old library and the entrance vestibule survived intact. The building was renamed the Allen Memorial Institute. Its first director was a Scottish-American psychiatrist named Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron, invited to the position by the famed Canadian neurologist Wilder Penfield. Cameron was considered one of the most eminent psychiatrists in the world, progressive, ambitious, charismatic. He believed in an open-door policy. He believed in the potential of psychiatry to cure mental illness, not merely manage it. He believed, most fatally of all, that the human mind could be erased and rewritten. The stone walls of Ravenscrag, which had held the grief of the Allen family for a quarter century, were about to hold something else entirely. The story of what happened at the Allen Memorial Institute from 1957 to 1964, and possibly earlier, begins not in Montreal, but in a secret meeting at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel on Sherbrooke Street on June 1, 1951. A joint American-British-Canadian intelligence initiative had gathered to discuss a question the Cold War had made urgent. Could the human mind be controlled? American prisoners of war in Korea appeared to have been brainwashed, making inexplicable confessions, praising communism, denouncing the United States. The CIA believed that if the Chinese could break men's minds, the Americans needed to know how. And they needed to know first. Dr. Donald Hebb, then director of psychology at McGill University, received a grant of $10,000 from that meeting to study sensory deprivation. He paid his own psychology students to remain isolated in a room, deprived of all senses, for an entire day. The results were disturbing, and, for the CIA, fascinating. Hebb's research suggested that the human mind, stripped of sensory input, began to hallucinate, became suggestible, became malleable. The implications for interrogation were obvious. Donald Ewan Cameron picked up where Hebb left off and drove the experiment into territory that Hebb would never have sanctioned. Cameron had developed a theory he called psychic driving. He believed that mental illness was caused by incorrect patterns of thinking, brain pathways laid down wrong that reinforced pathological behavior. His proposed solution was radical: erase the pathways entirely, reduce the patient to a mental blank, what Cameron called a vegetable state, and then rebuild them from scratch. He called the erasure process depatterning, the rebuilding repatterning. What this meant in practice for the human beings who entered the Allen Memorial Institute seeking treatment for depression, anxiety, and grief was this. Patients were placed in drug-induced sleep that could last from 15 days to 3 months. During this sleep, they were subjected to intensive electroconvulsive therapy, 2 to 3 daily sessions of 150-volt shocks, each lasting 6 seconds, administered at doses 30 to 40 times stronger than standard clinical practice. They were placed in sensory deprivation chambers, rooms stripped of light and sound, hands wrapped in cotton to prevent tactile sensation, eyes covered, ears blocked. They were given experimental hallucinogenic drugs, LSD, mescaline, barbiturates, in quantities that had never been tested on human subjects. And then, as they slept, still under sedation, still in chemical darkness, recordings were played into their ears. Voices repeating messages, looped endlessly. First, a negative statement drawn from the patient's own words. You are selfish. You are worthless. Then a positive affirmation. You are lovable. You are capable. Each message was repeated between 250,000 and 500,000 times. Some patients had the recordings played through speakers hidden beneath their pillows. Some were given a device that played the loop through a helmet clamped to their head. Hour after hour, day after day, week after week, none of these patients had given informed consent. None of them knew they were part of an experiment. They had come to the Allen Memorial Institute because they were suffering, because they trusted the most eminent psychiatrist in the world. Because the building on the hill above Montreal had presented itself as a place of healing. The CIA, which had been funding Cameron's work since 1957 through a front organization called the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, understood exactly what it was purchasing. MKUltra, the umbrella program containing Cameron's work as Subproject 68, was the agency's most secret research initiative, a systematic attempt to develop techniques of psychological manipulation and mind control for use in interrogation and covert operations. As it was illegal for the CIA to conduct experiments on American soil, Cameron carried out the work in Canada. He commuted to Montreal from Albany every week. He was paid $69,000 over the course of the program, funded through Cornell University to conceal the CIA's involvement. The Canadian government also funded Cameron's research, more than $500,000 between 1950 and 1965. When the experiments were at their most extreme, a patient named Gail Kastner emerged from the Allen Memorial Institute speaking like a baby, sucking her thumb, unable to recall any of her childhood memories. She was incapacitated for the remainder of her life. A man named Charles Tanney entered the institute as a hard-working, loving father and husband. He left it disconnected, emotionally absent, a stranger to the family that had sent him there for help. A teenage girl named Lana Ponting was referred to the institute by a judge after she had run away too many times. She emerged unable to recall 2 full years of her life. One woman, in her final years, sat alone in a dark room writing codes on the walls. Hundreds of patients were subjected to these treatments during Cameron's tenure. In many cases, family members described their loved ones as more emotionally damaged after treatment than before. Children had to be toilet trained again. Adults had to relearn skills they had practiced for decades. The grief rippled outward and spanned generations. Naomi Klein, in her 2008 book, The Shock Doctrine, documented how the findings from Cameron's Montreal experiments were incorporated into CYA interrogation manuals whose techniques would later be applied at Guantanamo Bay and CIA black sites around the world. The line from Ravenscrag to those dark rooms is not metaphorical. It is procedural. Cameron died of a heart attack while mountain climbing in 1967. Before the full extent of what he had done became publicly known, before he could be held accountable, before the people he had destroyed could face him with what he had taken from them. His portrait still hangs in the Allen Memorial Institute among the photographs of other past directors. His name has been removed from below the frame. The truth emerged slowly and reluctantly. In 1973, as the Watergate scandal was consuming the Nixon administration, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of all MKUltra files. Most were shredded, but a cache of documents had been misfiled in a financial records office, hidden from Helms's order by bureaucratic accident, and in 1977 they were discovered and released. In 1980, Canadians first learned what had happened at the Allen Memorial Institute when CBC's investigative program The Fifth Estate revealed the story. Survivors came forward publicly for the first time. They described their treatments in detail. They described what had been taken from them. The response of the institutions responsible was a masterwork of deflection. The CIA sent a formal apology to the Canadian government in 1984, and in the same communication asked the Canadian government not to share any details of the MKUltra program with former patients seeking compensation. The mid-1980s directors of the Allen Memorial Institute defended Cameron's actions, stating that psychiatrists of his era were not expected to inform their patients of the nature of their treatments. McGill University, decades later, argued that Cameron was not technically an employee of the Royal Victoria Hospital, and therefore the hospital bore no legal liability. 77 victims received compensation through the Canadian government's Allen Memorial Institute Depatterned Persons Assistance Plan in 1992. $100,000 each. The government simultaneously clarified that it bore no legal responsibility for what had occurred. The money was described as a humanitarian gesture. In 2017, the Canadian government reached an out-of-court settlement with one former patient's daughter, paying $100,000 in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement, preventing her from speaking publicly about what had happened to her mother. In July 2025, a Quebec Superior Court judge authorized a class action lawsuit brought by victims and their families, naming the Royal Victoria Hospital, McGill University, and the Government of Canada as defendants. The lawsuit alleges that these institutions funded and enabled treatments that violated patients' bodies and minds without their knowledge or consent. The case is ongoing. Neither the CIA nor the Canadian government has ever issued a formal apology. Many records remain classified. Cameron's personal files were destroyed after his death. The full scope of what happened inside Ravenscrag's stone walls during those years may never be fully known. The building stands above the campus. The tower is lit at night. The name on the sign outside reads Allen Memorial Institute, and at McGill University's official website, as of the most recent CBC reporting, there is no mention of this history at all. Accounts of strange occurrences at the Allen Memorial Institute are not recent phenomena. Caretakers have for years refused to enter certain parts of the building alone, particularly the basement areas that served as morgues during the building's psychiatric hospital years. Staff members who have worked night shifts describe sounds that cannot be attributed to old pipes or settling stone. Voices, indistinct and distressed, that seem to come from rooms confirmed to be empty. Disembodied sounds in corridors where no one stands. At night, according to McGill students and residents of the neighborhood below, a light sometimes appears in the cupola of the main tower, the same tower that Hugh Allen built to watch his ships, the same observatory from which his ambition extended its gaze across the city he controlled. The light appears when the building is locked, when the last staff member has left, when no one should be there. Haunted Montreal, the city's most prominent investigation of paranormal history, has assessed the upper buildings of the McGill campus as among the most ghost-ridden locations in the city. The Allen Memorial Institute, in their assessment, is the most haunted of them all. The rational explanations are available. Old buildings produce old sounds. The human pattern recognition system, evolved to detect threat in darkness, will find shapes and voices in ambiguous stimuli. A building known to have been the site of trauma will be approached with a priming that makes ordinary phenomena seem extraordinary. All of this is true. And yet, a building that absorbed the grief of the Allen family, the deaths of 4 children, the silence of a mansion emptied by war, and was then transformed into a site of deliberate psychological destruction where hundreds of human beings were stripped of their identities and memories while under the care of people they trusted, is not simply a collection of stone rooms. It is a record of everything that was taken here and never returned, of everyone who entered this building hoping for something and left carrying something else entirely. Whether or not ghosts are real, there is something in Ravenscrag that refuses to be quiet. Step back from the ghost lights in the tower. Step back from the seance-ready atmosphere of a Victorian mansion repurposed as a psychiatric facility. Look at Ravenscrag clearly, and what you find is something more disturbing than any supernatural account. What you find is a pattern. Sir Hugh Allen built Ravenscrag on wealth extracted through exploitation. Workers paid starvation wages, child labor in his factories, political bribery on a scale that brought down a government and corrupted the foundational promise of Canadian Confederation. His mansion was a monument to the belief that the powerful are exempt from the consequences that apply to everyone else. He was never charged with any crime. He died one of the richest men in the world. The tragedies that befell his son's family, the Lusitania, the lost children, the slow extinction of a dynasty, were not moral consequences for Hugh Allen's sins. The universe does not operate that way, but the pattern is visible. An institution founded on the premise that power exempts its holders from accountability will eventually hollow itself out. The Allen dynasty ended not because it was punished, but because there was nothing left to sustain it. And then Dr. Cameron arrived, and the pattern repeated. Cameron was a man who believed that the powerless existed to serve the ambitions of the powerful, that the patients who came to him for help were raw material for his theories, that their suffering was a laboratory resource to be exploited in service of science and the state. He was feted and honored throughout his career, holding simultaneously the presidencies of the American, Canadian, and World Psychiatric Associations, while conducting experiments that violated every ethical framework established after the Nuremberg trials. He was never charged with a crime. He died before anyone could make him answer for what he had done. The Canadian government that funded him has acknowledged a moral responsibility but denied legal liability. The CIA destroyed its files. McGill has removed Cameron's name from beneath his portrait but left the portrait on the wall. The class action lawsuit authorized in 2025, 70 years after the experiments began, is still making its way through a legal system not designed to reach back 7 decades and assign accountability for what was done in secret to people who did not know they were being harmed. The story of Ravenscrag is the story of what happens when power is exercised without accountability, when ambition is exempted from consequence, when the suffering of the vulnerable is treated as a price worth paying for the achievements of those above them. The building has changed hands 3 times over 160 years, and in each incarnation the same lesson has been embedded in its stone. Power, unaccountable, destroys, not only the people it acts upon, eventually itself. Ravenscrag still stands above the city. The pattern, as far as we can tell, has not yet run its course. Today, the Allen Memorial Institute still operates as McGill University's psychiatry department. Modern research continues in its rooms. Clinicians treat patients in the same halls where, 60 years ago, other patients were stripped of who they were. The terms of Lady Marguerite's 1940 donation remain technically in force. If the building ever ceases to operate as a medical facility, it reverts to the Allen descendants. Those descendants have, in recent years, proposed converting Ravenscrag into luxury condominiums. There is an ongoing dispute over the grounds between McGill University and the Kanyan Kaha Ka Conestensera, who allege the potential presence of human remains on the property. Whether a hidden cemetery exists beneath the mountain slope is, as of this writing, still unknown. Hugh Allen's name is remembered in Canadian history primarily as a synonym for corruption, the man whose bribery detonated the Pacific Scandal, who brought down Canada's first Prime Minister, who built the country's greatest private shipping empire and never got to control the railway. His knighthood stands. His mansion stands. His memory does not. The Allen Cup, donated by Montague, who outlived his children and his era with quiet dignity, is still awarded every year to the Canadian men's amateur ice hockey champions. Somewhere in a display case in a hockey arena, the Allen name endures in the context its bearer would have most wanted: generosity, sport, fair competition, the better version of itself. The class action lawsuit advances through the Quebec courts. The non-disclosure agreements hold. Cameron's personal files do not exist. The CIA's files are classified. And in the stone corridors of the building that Hugh Allen built to make himself permanent, the sounds that have no explanation continue at night, when the institution is quiet and the last staff member has gone home. The light in the tower appears. No one investigates. It goes out. What haunts Ravenscrag is not, in the end, difficult to name. It is the weight of unacknowledged harm, the specific gravity of suffering that was inflicted deliberately, recorded carefully, and then destroyed so it could never be used as evidence. It is the accumulated presence of everyone who entered this building hoping to be healed and left carrying something worse than what they arrived with. Whether or not buildings can remember, this one has not forgotten. And on the slope of Mount Royal, above the Golden Square Mile, above the campus where students walk with their phones and their coffee, above the graves in the cemetery on the hill, the tower of Ravenscrag catches the last light of the evening sky.